a lot of times does exist in other browsers. And the real thing you end up wondering about is if the bug's in the latest version of the browser, you don't know if it's going to be fixed when the next version of the browser is released. So you're basically, by doing version detection, rolling the dice a little bit and guessing, is that bug still going to be there next time or not? By doing behavior detection in those sorts of cases, your site will automatically adapt. And the cost here is the risk of breaking when new browsers are released. So let's take a look at some more code examples. We've got the canonical user agent detection I talked about earlier. But version detection comes in a lot of different flavors. Document.all using object detection is still really a form of version detection. You can also get this through libraries. Just because you're using jQuery, if you're relying on browser-specific detection through jQuery APIs, it's still browser detection. Specifically, the documentation for the jQuery.browser API strongly recommends against using this in your sites and encourages the use of jQuery.support to do feature detection instead. You also can see this outside of script. This is a particular popular one since conditional comments are an IE feature. And people have worked around CSS differences in IE6 and IE7 for a number of years. Now, the problem is something that we saw a lot when we shipped IE8. We shipped greatly improved CSS 2.1 support. But what we found is some sites would still display weird. And it wasn't a bug in the CSS support itself, but rather detection like this, where they're saying, oh, you're IE, so I must have to feed you the IE6 CSS, which won't display right in any modern standards-compliant browser. Now, if you have to do the version detection, because sometimes it is admittedly a little bit more complicated to do behavior or feature detection, make sure you target legacy only, because this is a lot safer. You're not playing that guessing game that I talked about earlier, where you're wondering whether something's going to be fixed or added in the next version. Things that have occurred in the past and have already been changed are a much more reliable form of something that you can detect. So I want to talk now about something that's a little bit more subtle. Version detection is pretty explicit and it's pretty easy to identify in your sites. But assuming unrelated features isn't quite as much. The pattern goes a little something like this. You're using different features and you're working in a particular browser. You've done good feature detection for a particular feature, and you know that this browser supports a few others. Since currently, at least in the browsers you're testing, you don't know of any other configuration, you might go ahead and use some of those features without explicitly testing for them. This can come back to be a problem in the future, and specifically a risk of your site breaking. But let me show you a specific example. In IE8, we also added a new API called PostMessage for doing secure cross-document messaging. And what we saw in one of the high-traffic sites that we were testing is that they did something effectively like this. Now, obviously, there was a lot more code in between, and so it wasn't as clear when you just looked at it. But they detected PostMessage and figured that at the time, every browser that supported PostMessage had support for Add Event Listener, which we didn't add until IE9. So for IE8, this put it in a bad state where you would effectively just get a script error as soon as you tried to call Add Event Listener. So if these practices are so good, why aren't we all using them already? Because there's still a number of sites on the web relying on version detection and using unrelated features. I mean, part of the problem is that version detection, you've got one solution you can use everywhere. You've got one piece of code you write. You don't have to change it when you use it at different points within your page. Here, each solution is a little bit different. It's also a lot easier to think in terms of what browser supports feature A or feature B. And it's a lot easier when you only have to think about having a single pivot. But the key thing to remember is the cost of following version detection practices as opposed to feature detection. Like, if you want to make sure that you take as much control as you can in developing your sites to be agile and adaptable into the future with new browser releases, taking advantage of feature detection is the way to do that. So now I want to show you a few examples of how feature detection looks outside of script, because we got into that at the beginning with CSS, and it's clearly more than just if-else statements in JavaScript. The CSS example in particular I want to talk a little bit more about when we're using border radius. The nice thing here is that it's kind of natural in the way that you automatically do feature detection. Browsers ignore properties that they don't recognize. So when a browser does early adoption using, say, -moz or -webkit, they can continue to recognize that property. But once they support the unprefixed version, that one takes precedent over their vendor prefix. Therefore, they automatically click over into using the standardized code path. Let's talk a little bit about HTML. Now, one of the things we showed the other day was HTML5 video, which I think a lot of people are excited about. And it's one of a number of elements in HTML that have built-in fallback mechanics. Sometimes it's for whether a given element is supported. Other times it's whether, the particular video format you're trying to use is supported in the browser that you're using. The nice thing here is if that video tag fails for any reason, whether it's unrecognized by the browser or whether it doesn't have a codec for the video you're trying to load, it'll fall back to the content inside. Now here I've used an object tag, which has similar mechanics, but you can also envision nesting different video tags themselves. So if you want to have a video in one format and a video in another and use the video tag for both, you can just nest them right inside of each other. What gets a little bit more complicated is when you're dealing with things that don't have that type of natural fallback, such as SVG in HTML5. Here, older browsers that don't actually have the ability to recognize it will simply treat it as generic elements, and it effectively gets styled as a span, or if it's styled at all. Now, this is okay if your elements don't have any text content, because it just won't display, and you can provide some alternate content. But if you have some text in here, say you have a title or description or some other text that you're displaying as part of your graphic, what you're going to get is that text displaying straight up on the page with no vector graphics around it. So this is where I want to step into another demo where I can show kind of a preliminary detection technique that I've been working on, and I'm definitely looking for feedback. I'm not saying this one is necessarily the best practice. So what I've worked up here is I've got some SVG in HTML, which will work in IE9. I've got a description, which in SVG is hidden anyway, so it definitely shouldn't display when I'm running in an older browser. But the key thing here is it is text. And I've got some fallback content I've set up for when, or at least what I want to be displayed when I'm running in a browser that doesn't support SVG and HTML. Now, if we go ahead and look at that in the platform preview and Firefox today, switch over to 9 mode. So I'm getting the SVG I want in IE9 mode, but I'm also seeing my fallback content because I haven't really done anything special yet. If I go ahead and open this up in Firefox, I'm getting the text that was inside of my SVG block because by default it doesn't do SVG and HTML. There is a setting you can go and turn on yourself. And then I also get the fallback content. Now this is definitely not the degradation experience that I want. And if I flip over to 8 mode, which doesn't do SVG and HTML, you see the same thing. So what can I do about it? Well, specifically, I'm going to try to avoid using script as much as possible because you can actually take advantage of some new CSS features that we've added in IE9 that are supported by the other browsers. Specifically, namespace selectors. When you create an SVG element in an HTML5 page, it ends up in the SVG namespace, which all SVG elements do.